So this session runs in parallel with others. So thank you for choosing the subject. We'll be together for 45 minutes. So Mr. Simon will talk for about 30 minutes. That'll leave us some time to talk an exchange on gambling and harm reduction. Now this is important because initially harm reduction emerged following studies concerning the injection of drugs usually. But more broadly speaking, harm management and reduction related to substance abuse should be applied to any user, whether addicted or not. And of course, for those who are being addicted, it should be further extended with perhaps a different, with different modalities. So that's what we're talking about here. So who's Olivier Simon? Our speaker is a psychiatrist working in Lausanne with the University Hospital of Lausanne, and for long has had an interest in addictions, public health, and societal aspects. Let me just tell you that he also co-moderated a group of experts with the Georges Pompidou Hospital in Paris, who considered the situation of addiction to opiates and the, I would say, the duties of states to grant access to treatments for these subjects. Thank you very much, Marc. Thank you for the ATHS conference for inviting me here. So is harm reduction applicable to the prevention and the treatment of excessive gamblers? I am from Switzerland, and as you know, Switzerland is known to be a small, quiet country. So if you come and visit us in Zurich, you may recognize that nice place by the lake. This picture can be superimposed to that one. This one is very famous worldwide. This was in fact the starting point of a long policy of harm reduction and risk reduction in Switzerland. So we can speak indeed of harm reduction, as they say in English, but I stick to the French RDR abbreviation, if you don't mind. That stands for risks reduction, reduction of risks. So that's a cartoon that in fact refers to the Swiss policy of harm reduction, which is based on the so-called 4 pillars. So it's quite interesting to understand how this policy was presented to the public, how communication got organized. In the beginning, it was presented as a kind of Greek temple with 3 pillars, and then a 4th was to be added, which was called help to survival, following prevention, treatment, and identification. So this Greek temple very often looks very much like a court. So this entails a notion of repression. And the idea of helping survival was in fact perhaps not a good idea. Help to survival should be, or aid to survival should perhaps have been represented as a kind of roof So this is why later on this was represented as a cube with 4 pillars on the 4 sides, and then on the other 2, the various substances like alcohol, tobacco, and drugs on one of the remaining 2, and then on another, on the final one, the most recreative aspects of abuse and the phenomenon of dependence. So the Swiss Public Health Council decided to combine gambling with alcohol, drugs, and others. So the cube was made much more simple. The pillar concerning repression has been called regulation, and harm reduction moved back upwards. And then we added some other elements around the cube with international policies. Now this, of course, refers to international treaties on human rights and the Council of Europe and so on and so forth. Then coordination. It's because we are a federal country. So as you know that we are so-called micro-states that are to be, so to speak, piloted by or steered by a federal state. Knowledge is the will to have a better understanding of all these phenomena. Okay, sorry about that. And then we have to have the public be made responsible in a country where we are very liberal and where individual responsibility is always placed at the forefront. So what about gambling? There's a long past history of state intervention. I like this medieval image. It's Alfonso of Castile who had in fact drafted the first treaty concerning gambling. So on the right is his secretary, and on the left is the public, the gamblers who've lost a lot. So this is just a first example of a specific intervention of the state to reduce a certain number of issues related to gambling. Now, of course, things have changed since then. There's been a pretty massive industrialization of gambling, if I may say, in the 1950s and 60s with the creation of casinos. And pathological gambling was introduced in the DSM in the 1980s already. Then in 1990 came the internet and screen addiction. And since 2010, smartphones came into play. So gambling, which were, I would say, were not very much of a problem, became something else as soon as they were available on a screen. So let me just give you a brief outline of my talk. It'll be made in 3 parts. I'll say a few words about the dominant model in terms of prevention policies related to gambling disorders. This is what is called responsible gambling. And then I will continue with harm reduction. Is it a real track to follow to come up with a proper responsible gambling type of society? And then we'll get further into the details of what it means in practical terms in the case of gambling. And then I will conclude with the idea of perhaps changing the notion of harm reduction to be more fitted to gambling. So what is responsible gambling? This is in fact a a kind of deviation of a concept that you're all familiar with. I guess it's the corporate social responsibility, or CSR, which has to think in terms of environmental and societal damage related to their industrial activities or commercial activities. Now, the word responsible becomes quite ambiguous here. Of course, there is who's responsible in the case of gambling? Is it gambling per se, or is it the gambler him or herself? Now, this model was endorsed by a certain number of pioneers, researchers in the field of gambling. So rightly or wrongly, but they had no choice, I guess. They started working with the funds of the gambling industry. So they came up with a kind of agreement where everybody is at the same level: operators, states, research workers, gamblers. So I'll give you a few examples as an illustration to show you the limits of the model. So let me take you to Switzerland. We have a 3-minute clip that was presented during the news broadcast in Switzerland, which I think is quite useful. Thousands of Swiss francs lost over a few hours. This is the current routine of this man. He is using those machines that you can find in bars. Well, I believe these machines are quite dangerous. It's like a disease. You can't stop. In Switzerland, gambling generates 900 million francs a year, but addiction to gambling is also estimated at a cost of 600 million. We don't pay our bills. We've dropped everything. So when you're involved in gambling, there's nothing else but gambling. How much did you owe then? 1 million francs. Now, this man is not the only one to be so much indebted. Gamblers who come for help are, I would say, for half of them gambling with casinos and the other half with electronic lotteries. So this is just 1 to 2% of the population, but as gamblers lose huge amounts of money, they do account for 40% of the benefits. Yes, in fact, these benefits are taken from out of the pocket of people with severe problems, so there comes ethics. However, operators of electronic lotteries do combat these figures. We work with the scientific community to show that this so-called population at risk is indeed very limited in terms of numbers. Unfortunately, they're not able to produce the figures. On the Parliament side, another bill is being considered with a possible control of access to machines. But the industry, of course, believes that a status quo is just fine. Well, it's quite obvious that we have trained our various agents to identify these compulsive gamblers and direct them to healthcare. Of course, obviously, the agent, that is the bartender, gets a commission from these machines, something like 2,000 Swiss francs per month. Now, this is clearly contradictory to have, on the one hand, free access to gambling, and on the other hand, protecting gamblers. So the Swiss office thinks of a system which unfortunately has disappeared from the bill. So we can see what the danger, what the risks are for the operators, for the state, for the public service on the one hand, and for the health services on the other hand, and the scientific community, which I am a member of. So a lot of things have disappeared from the actual bill. A lot of things have been removed from the bill. The state has had to cross off a certain number of elements. Now, to get back to some concrete examples that were truly experienced in the field, here are a few of them that I have observed personally as I work with a specialized unit for gambling. So every now and then, they ask us, the operators ask us to, the gambling industry ask us to have pictures of us just to, sort of give them credentials for their cooperation with us. Or they want us to appear in some public events organized by them, or they like to tell that we have developed some equipment to identify pathological gamblers, etc. And this is absolutely not true. Or the operators don't want to ask to fill in questionnaires with questions that are probably detrimental to them. Some of our colleagues did accept to produce research work, but then were imposed censorship on their work. In the same way, during some conferences, they were also faced with the same problem of censorship. So, in fact, criticisms have been more and more sharp against this new model of protection of gamblers. Now, we still have this dominant model of so-called responsible gambling. Even if it is not satisfactory, what would be the model of harm reduction? So let's take a look at definitions. The least we can say is that things are pretty much confusing and lack scientific evidence, obviously, but this is certainly left to the political environment of these bills and aspects. We find some work done by the World Health Organization. Then we've had more work done during the peak of the HIV crisis. So there was a kind of umbrella wording in relation with human rights that was applied to this, related to the idea of abstinence. And of course, the idea that also came up was that we didn't want to be judgmental. Of course, there are ethical aspects. Referring to Hippocrates' oath, and of course we have to consider the individual decision of using or not using substances. From the fundamental rights point of view, we have to consider the fact that no discrimination should be applied just because of substance use. The right to access to health services should also be granted. In other words, the right to health care. But other rights are also involved, like the right to life, the right not to be submitted to degrading treatments. For example, leaving you wean off without any aid, but we also have to consider the rights like rights to social care, the job market, and so on and so forth. So what are the current definitions of harm reduction in the literature? Well, roughly speaking, there are two trends. On the one hand, there are definitions to be found in governmental agencies, for example, or intergovernmental agencies, which are, I would say, more based on an operational mode with measurements and measures as well, and which do not question the prohibitionist international treaties. And then comes a second trend, more in line with the definitions agreed upon by professional or committees or associations. You have a certain number of them in the different countries with different names, of course. Now, if we take a look at the definition given by intergovernmental organizations, we can see that we have a full list of measures. And if we look at the definition given by Harm Reduction International, those harm reduction are quite practical. Now, the common point, in fact, between them is to reduce negative consequences in terms of health or in terms of socio-economic aspects without necessarily decreasing substance consumption or use, which does not mean that we do not decrease our efforts to put an end or to at least decrease this consumption and to avoid discrimination of these people. So the harm reduction system is now rooted, it should be rooted in human rights. It's interesting to take a look at the overlap with the modern definition of public health. Now, this is a definition that I found in one of the major documents concerning public health. Science is the art of extending life, promoting life and health with conjugated efforts and with the informed participation of the public. So it starts, the mobilization starts from the local level, that's a bottom-up approach, but it also introduces the idea that actions are determined by qualitative assessments as well as quantitative ones. And this is obviously something that is not to be found in the conventional harm reduction definitions, but obviously the overlap is pretty large. Now, in practical terms, if we wish to apply this to gambling, what are the issues? How can you measure harm, and how can you reduce harm in terms of production, gross production of public policies? What are the packages of measures that could be interesting, and are the measures promoted by the industry show any interest? And is there any credibility in those measures imposed by operators? Now, if we consider the measurement of of harm, in fact, I think I'd say the most well-known definition is that of the WHO, with the loss of quality of life. This has not been very much applied, however, but this is, for example, an interesting Australian survey where harm has been measured in relation with different types of disorders. So here above you have depression and alcohol. In red, we have the harm related to gambling. And the second red bar here shows the issues, that is, people who are not really pathological gamblers, but who've had some issues with gambling that may have an impact on their family circle, etc., their family environment, because they are on a sick leave or whatever. Okay, so this remains pretty much theoretical, but it is still possible to have an assessment of the harm done in order to reach a further objective. Now, Measurements have not been really very much documented. This one is quite interesting. It was done by the Observatory on Gambling. So I'm not going to review that into details because we want to save time for the discussion. So we have, in fact, two axes, the y-axis and the x-axis, depending on the degree of implementation. Obviously, the most effective measures are not so much implemented, actually. The most implemented ones are the ones that are not really effective or efficient, which means that, first of all, you don't only have to identify packages of measures, but you have to have state intervention if you want to address the issue of priorities in harm reduction related to gambling. Then comes the question of credibility of the efforts undertaken to protect gamblers. Now, there's an interesting indicator. It's the share of pathological gamblers in the benefits of the gambling industry. So this is a French study dated 2014, and this gives us some indication on the amounts being bet by those pathological gamblers. The news report I showed you mentioned 40%, but for more addictive gambling gimmicks like online gambling, it may be much higher than 40%. And then they considered the dependence of the one who spent the most. So what is the share of the income? If the game is not very addictive, it may be just 20, it may not be 1%, but if it is more addictive, it may be generating more for online addictions, and it can be as high as 60%. So this gives us quite interesting proxies that are not costly, in fact. So if there is a real political will to work on that, and this could give rise to a model of impact, but I don't have time to get into the details. This is left to public policies if they really want to do something about it. So as a conclusion, what can gambling offer in the definition of harm reduction? There's something that is not controversial, that this is a person-centered aspect with the protection, the fundamental protection of the fundamental rights. But there are more specific aspects. I think we should clearly reaffirm that the goal is not to help just one individual, but to reduce the actual load. In fact, the number of people being pathological is about the same in all countries, but there are countries where more protective measures have been taken, where gambling is accessible, but not that much, so that the pathological gamblers may, so to speak, handle their disorders without too many repercussions on their families. And the countries are much more liberal without any protection. The number of gamblers is the same, but most of them have, for example, ruined their company because they stole money from the safe. They're left unemployed. Their spouses fall ill because of the stress, etc. And the social bill, if I may say, is absolutely unbelievable. So I insist we have to consider reducing the harm on an overall scale. Besides, gambling suggests that harm reduction cannot be dissociated from market regulation measures. And last, harm reduction should be part of a public policies evaluation system with assessment of processes on the one hand and assessment of results on the other hand. So this is a list of references. This is something that may be of interest to you. And then let me just advertise for this booklet that we published only recently, if you want to take a closer look at what is at stake. Thank you very much for your attention.
Merci beaucoup pour cette présentation. Et donc...
Thank you very much for this presentation and for shedding light on the dual stakes of harm reduction in discussions with partnerships, because it's about intervening without targeting the disorder itself in terms of behavior. And also, it's about pathological gambling, and it's a question of public health. Even though sometimes we have seen here that there's a specific problem here, which is very serious. And so I'd like to open the floor to discussion now. If you'd like to speak, please raise your hand. Arrived a little later, I'm not sure you talked about this. Are the solutions for gambling, for video games, have you talked about this? In access to help, there's a whole section about, perhaps I should start by saying that those people who are diagnosed as having disorders with regard to gambling, what we can see is that there's a very small proportion who consult specialized services, around 5 to 10% maximum. And so we thought a lot about the means for giving access to this. What were the reasons behind these numbers? Stigmatization, the difficulty of actually making the first step. I'm not sure how it works in France. You have a franchise to pay in for 2,500 Swiss francs. But when you're in financial difficulty, then this could be an issue. So we propose helplines and internet applications to enter into help the process of help. And the results, in Switzerland at least, the results are rather mixed. We don't have enough in order to say we're rather disappointed by the use of applications until now. But this is a problem which goes beyond pathological gambling. It's the same for other health problems and addictions. It's difficult to assess where the obstacles really lie. But this is perhaps something to be explored in the future, and the behavior of the public with regard to accessing help. Any other questions? Good morning. My question follows on from the, could you develop you were saying that the measures were not very efficient. Were they efficient? If we go back to this, in the group of inefficient measurements which were appreciated by players, it was behavioral prevention. We know this in particular in the field of addictions. We have a lot of this is very well documented, and there's health messages. For example, gambling is risky. In Switzerland, the industry fought against this, and they actually obtained, finally got them to be taken off. But they're not very, very efficient. And then there's the training of staff, perhaps, which is more efficient. In Switzerland, it's part of the law. So operators have an obligation to train their staff, and in the group on the right here, you have the most efficient measures, which is restricting publicity, restricting sales of alcohol and tobacco, and the supervision of marketing. With typically measures on the design of gambling products. It's efficient, but the operators do all they can to fight against these. And then there are also measures in the green circle, with restrictions in terms of access and interventions on the cost of certain games. This depends on the different jurisdictions, but it's starting to be acceptable. It's not sufficiently developed and implemented. I don't know if that answers your question. Another difficulty is that in light of the knowledge we have, there are no specific studies for gambling. So we have one single measurement, but measurements work in a context, and we need to evaluate the measurement system. So as far as we know, we also have to base this on tobacco or alcohol, where there's much more literature. And also the question of establishing priorities. It's not a market of goods. It would have to look at the possible health risks, and these would have to take into account economic freedom. Let's start at the back, and then a final question at the front. I come from Strasbourg, which is next to Germany, where there's a more liberal practice of gambling, and what I can see is that many people in Strasbourg go to these bars where there are slot machines, and what I often see is people who already have financial difficulties. And I was surprised to see that spent $1 million Swiss francs, and the the problems occur more quickly for those in financial difficulty. And the other issue is there's no way of changing the legislation in Germany. So how do you see things? What can we do? I'll try to target my answer here because there's several points. The temporality of disorders. The person spent $1 million over 20 years, but those in who go to play in gamble in Germany, they have already developed disorders. Because you go from recreational gambling to problematic gambling. The process is very insidious, and it's another something else which is to be taken into account. And also the public problem occurs a long time after the addiction starts. There's always a delay in terms of how. A final question. Please try to be precise here because we don't want to go over time. So quickly, a final question. The problem for state services in terms of regulating gambling, there are legal texts in France since 1910 in France, which provide with certain tools which are made available, and the operators believe they're virtuous. They work with the Française des Jeux and representatives of casinos, and going further for them is to put them in competition with illegal operators. I'm not sure if in Switzerland, if this is the question, if this is relevant. In Switzerland, we haven't. In Switzerland, we said there's an offer of a very aggressive offer for gambling, which is legal, and so therefore you. The challenge is to have a differentiated approach and to try to find the optimum way of reducing harm. With regard to the question that you've just raised, it's a very big challenge. We have to give ourselves the means to do this. I think the French are ahead in this game because AURIACOMBE evaluated this when implementing online gaming in France. And with the current framework, I can't remember the exact figures, but the regulated offer is around half of the market, which is a satisfactory result, but it shows the questions which this raises. Thank you for your talk and for the questions. Please continue to talk with Olivier Simon. We now have to move on to this next workshop.